Well, we're excited about today's podcast. We have a special guest joining us, Dr. Ken Keathley, whom Dr. Craig will introduce in a moment. Dr. Keathley is the editor of a new book about to be released, Perspectives on the Historical Adam and Eve, Four Views. And Bill, you are one of those four contributors.
Right.
Introduce Dr. Keathley for us, please.
Well, Ken, I want to say welcome. We're glad that you could be on this Reasonable Faith podcast with Kevin and me. For our listeners, Ken is the research professor of theology and the chair of theology at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary in Wake Forest, North Carolina, where he's been teaching since 2006. He also directed the Russ Bush Center for Faith and Culture, a center that seeks to engage culture, present and defend the Christian faith, and explore its implications for all areas of life. Ken's the author of Salvation and Sovereignty, a Molinist approach, which certainly caused some ripples, I'm sure, in his denominational circles, and the co-author of 40 Questions About Creation and Evolution. He's also the co-editor of Old Earth or Evolutionary Creation. So, Ken, why don't you tell us a little bit about this new book and your involvement as the editor?
Well, Bill, thank you. And I'm glad to be a part of your program today. The book is the result of a colloquium that was held at the Bush Center here at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary in April of 2022. And there were about 20 participants in this colloquium, Old Testament scholars, theologians, apologists, philosophers, just a great spectrum of evangelical believers who were all very interested in this topic of the historical Adam and Eve. The only person who was not able to attend the conference was you, Bill, because you gave us a scare. That morning, you were not on the plane. We wondered what happened to you. I called Jan, and she says, you're in the hospital because you had COVID. I don't know I'm sure you remember that very well.
Oh, yes, COVID with pneumonia. And so I remember that colloquium well for not being there.
Well, the nice thing about the colloquium, the way that it was structured, is that each of the essays had already been turned in to all the participants. So everyone had already had the opportunity to read the essays. And so the purpose of the colloquium was not just to hear the essays, but to have the feedback. And so I presented a synopsis of your position in your absence. But we then were able to have the kind of conversation and dialogue that I think helped to improve the book. That kind of back and forth conversation, hearing a person express their support, our reservations. I think that helped to help the arguments of the book as they were presented. I mean, the book has three parts. It has the essays, it has the responses, and then it has a rejoinder by the author. And I think that really helps the reader get a pretty good idea of what happened at the colloquium.
Well, now you've been teaching and writing on creation and evolution. And in the introduction to the book, you say that it's not evolution per se that is the issue. So what do you think is the main issue?
Yeah, the idea of the mutability of species is something that there's a surprising amount of agreement among evangelicals. In fact, even young earth creationists such as Ken Ham and Answers in Genesis, they adopt a particular model of speciation to explain what happened after Noah's Ark. You know, they argue that there were only about 1,500 species on Noah's Ark that operated sort of as a proto-canine, proto-bovine, as the major carrier for the respective kinds. And that after they stepped off of the ark, there was a rapid speciation that occurred that accounts for the myriad of species that we see today. So the idea of the mutability of species is not the issue per se. No, it's really about the uniqueness of humanity and the doctrine of the fall. The explanation and the understanding how it is that the human condition is not the way that it ought to be and the way it's supposed to be. And so I think that the doctrine of anthropology, Adam and Eve, that really is the point in which we have the greatest amount of disagreement and for good reason. I think that really it is a more important issue than perhaps whether or not mutability of species is actually a thing.
Mm-hmm. Let me press that point a little further, Ken. That's really interesting. You're suggesting that it is really the doctrine of the fall that is critical here. And would you include in that mutability of species the mutability of the human species? That is to say that even if Homo sapiens and other Homo forms share a common ancestor with chimpanzees and gorillas and other apes, that's not really a big stumbling block for the biblical Christian.
Well, that is one of the issues of the book, is it not? I mean, that is one of the points of disagreement that perhaps Marcus Ross or Andrew Loke might have with other positions, such as Kenton's. So I think that we who would hold to the uniqueness of the human race of Adam and Eve, that there has to be some type of way that we understand them to be the special creation of God. That there is something unique about this couple that cannot be reduced down to mere natural explanations. I think there's something about us that is a step above. Whether one wants to understand this to be a special creation, as some old earth creationists would argue, or some would argue that God used hominids and then endowed them with an eternal soul, if one wants to take that approach. There are a variety of approaches that are either accepted or rejected by evangelicals. But yes, I think that the thing that is the crucial point is the historicity of the original couple.
Okay. Now, a few years ago, there was a Four Views book on Adam and Eve that I recall John Walton and Jack Collins and several others participated in about 10 years ago or so. What would be some of the distinctions or differences in this new book?
Yeah, well, at the time the book came out, just about that very same time, Carl Trueman made a comment in an article that the question of the historicity of Adam and Eve was going to be the theological issue of the next decade. And I think that the plethora of books that have come out on the issue shows that he's on to something. And along with that Four View books, like I said, there's a number of books, including yours and Joshua Swamadas's, who's also part of our book, one of the authors of our present book. That is the original Four Views book. Matthew Barrett was the editor. It's a very good book. But as you know, a lot has happened in the last 10 years, both in biblical studies and in the scientific knowledge that we have. And so two of the views that are presented in our book, the mytho-historical view that you advocate, and the genealogical position, Adam and Eve, advocated by Andrew Loke and Joshua Swamadas, these are two positions that have been advocated within the last 10 years. And so I think that it is a good thing, and let me say that over again. I think it is time for an update on the various views that are being offered within the evangelical spectrum.
It's interesting that in the new book, there's no trace of John Walton's functional interpretation of the creation narratives, which I think is good that it's gone by the board.
Yeah, the closest to John's position would probably be Kenton's view. I suspect that there's a great deal of agreement between those two. But your point, you're right. We probably could have had 8 views or 10 views. There's so many that's being, but I think that these 4 representative positions, I think that they do a good job of covering the waterfront.
Okay. In one of your lectures, Ken, you tell the story of sitting next to Walter Kaiser, Old Testament scholar who was my dean at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. And you were traveling to the Evangelical Theological Society conference a few years ago. And you reported that on the plane, he predicted that 50% of the ETS members would soon be theistic evolutionists. I wonder if you have any data on the accuracy of Walt's prediction.
Well, I don't know about members of ETS. There are studies by Pew Research saying that it is at least 50%. In fact, I think the latest study shows that it's somewhere around almost 2/3 of all evangelicals are open to the idea that evolution played a role in the bringing about of the world as we see it today. Yes, I do remember that plane ride with Dr. Kaiser. This was in the mid-2000s, something like 2005 or 2006, somewhere along in there. And he said, the book by Francis Collins is going to cause, it's going to generate a lot of conversation. And I said, well, what book is that? That's how long ago this was. I had not read The Language of God by Francis Collins. And at that time, Biologos as an organization hadn't started. And so I think that, the last 20 years shows that Dr. Kaiser knew what he was talking about. And that, like I said, I may not have data about the members of ETS, but I think that there's pretty good, at least anecdotal evidence. And like I said, the broader evangelical community, there's research that indicates that yes, he turned out to be right.
Mm-hmm. Now, in the introduction to this book, you chronicle some of the history of the challenges to a traditional view of Adam and Eve. Can you talk about some of the modern challenges?
Yes. Well, to your point, this is actually a 500-year-old conversation. The first time there was truly a crisis about the historicity of Adam and Eve is whenever Columbus discovered North and South America. You read The City of God by Augustine. He knows the earth is round. The ancient world understood the world to be round. What they didn't believe is that there were antipodes, that there were people on the other side of the world. And the reason for this, Augustine said, is because, well, how would they get there? It's too far away. And the Bible does not deceive us. It's without error. I mean, he argues the authority of Scripture. Well, as we all know, in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and he thought he was going to go to India. He would have never made it. He thought the world was only about 12,000 miles around. The Catholic scholars warned him it's more like 25,000 miles around, and they were right. It was his good fortune to run into North and South America. In fact, he called them Indians. That's how the term was coined. There was a theological crisis at that time. There were colloquia and debates and discussions. Who are these people? Where did they come from? And if they descended from Adam and Eve, how did they get there? And if they didn't descend from Adam and Eve, are they human beings? What are we supposed to think of this? So the Pope actually issued an edict called a Sublimus Deus, in which he said, we may not know how they got there, but they are descendants of Adam and Eve. They're human beings, and we need to evangelize them. And this birthed the modern missionary movement. The Jesuits go out, and the Protestant missionaries follow not long after. And so what you and I associate with, how we think of missionaries, that was actually spurred on by the first theological crisis about Adam and Eve. And so through the centuries, there were other conversations as the taxonomy of the various species become an issue. There is the discovery of Neanderthal bones and other hominins. Then in the 20th century, the issue, and we've already talked about it with mentioning Walter Kaiser, Dr. Francis Collins, who is a wonderful evangelical Christian, was leading the Human Genome Project. And of course, that resulted at the end of the 20th century with the mapping of the human DNA for the very first time. It cost billions of dollars to be done the very first time. And now if you want to, you can have 23andMe map your DNA for a few $100s. It's amazing the progress that's been made in just 25 years. There are some genetic challenges that the Human Genome Project presented us with. It seems, according to their studies, that the human population never came to a bottleneck smaller than maybe 1,000 people. There are those who debate that and push back on that, and that's a conversation that's going on even as we speak among the various scientists. But this presented a set of problems or challenges to our understanding of the origin of the human race. And so this created the atmosphere for the conversation that we're having right now.
Right. Very good. You also mentioned a book written in 1961, The Genesis Flood by Henry Morris and John Whitcomb. What kind of impact did that book have?
It's hard to exaggerate the impact that Whitcomb and Morris had with their book, The Genesis Flood. It's hard for us today as evangelicals to grasp, but prior to 1961, the majority position, the overwhelming consensus among not just evangelicals, but actually fundamentalists, was that the world was ancient. The overwhelming majority of evangelical Christians were old earth creationists, if we were going to use a label like we use today. They held to either the gap theory. Bill, I'm old enough to remember the Scofield Bible. And how it just seemed like if you were a Bible-believing Christian, you had to have a Scofield Bible in your hand. And when you read the Scofield notes, it argued for the gap theory, that there is a gap between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2, and that Genesis 1 is actually the recreation of the earth, and it left room for an ancient world. The other position was the day-age view that today is argued perhaps the strongest proponent of that position would be Hugh Ross. Along comes the Genesis Flood, written by Whitcomb and Morris, in which they argue very strongly that all of the geological evidence that we see, the geological column, can be explained by the flood of Noah. And it had a profound impact upon evangelicalism. One thing they didn't address is the starlight and time problem. I mean, I think they gave like 5 to 10 pages to it, which is remarkable whenever you consider what a remarkable challenge. Just the fact that we are in this enormous universe. I mean, how is it that the Earth is only 10,000 years old when I can see starlight from the other side of the Milky Way, which is supposedly 120,000 light years away? So that means it took over 100,000 years to get here. Well, they don't really address that problem at all. They focus on geology. The book sold over 300,000 copies within a decade. And whenever I attended Bible college in the 1970s, it was the book that all of us were reading. I dog-eared my copy and came out of Bible college an adamant young earth creationist because I believed that they had made a compelling case for the young earth position. So that had a profound impact upon how we as evangelicals approach the conversation today, which is why I think that we have to give Whitcomb and Morris credit that the reason why up until recently, I think most conservative evangelicals identified as young earth creationists. I know that's undoubtedly true in my denomination. I teach at a Southern Baptist seminary, and I'm a member of a Southern Baptist church, as are you. I think that the vast majority of Southern Baptists are young earth creationists. And I think that this is a direct result of the impact of Whitcomb and Morris's book.
Dr. Keathley, one of the theological issues that you bring up in the introduction is the scandal of particularity. Define that for us and how it relates to the book.
Yeah, the expression, I didn't coin the term scandal of particularity, but I think it really does to describe the situation well. As Bible-believing Christians, we believe that one man got us all into this mess. So we have a universal problem, and it is the fact that we are fallen and that we are sinful. We argue that this universal malady was caused by one person, by one man's sin entered into the world, is the way the Apostle Paul describes it in Romans chapter 5. We also believe that one man is the answer to this universal problem, and that man is Jesus Christ. And that there is no other name given among men but whereby we must be saved. And so this is a scandal. It always has been a scandal. It's been a scandal since the earliest days of the church that we hold to the scandal of particularity, that God has chosen to redeem the world through a particular man. He calls a particular man in Genesis, Abraham, and makes a covenant with him and promises that through his seed, singular, all the nations of the world will be blessed. This is very much a scandalous thing. When the early church evangelized, the pagan skeptics threw this into our faces. So it's always been a stumbling block. I think that the present conversation that we're having about the historical Adam just highlights that. But we need to recognize there's nothing new about this scandal.
Bill, is there anything about the scandal that came up when you were doing your work on the atonement?
I did not address that issue in my work on the atonement, which was a defense of a theory of the atonement whereby Christ's substitutionary death on our behalf is redemptive. I think that the scandal of particularity that Ken is talking about is that the atonement wrought by Christ is unique in providing the way of salvation, that Christ is the way, the truth, and the life, and that no one comes to God the Father except through him. And so that's a subsequent issue to how the atonement wrought our redemption. But it certainly goes against the grain of our relativistic society in which we live today, which says that it doesn't matter what you believe as long as you are sincere. And this scandal of particularity denies that. It says you can be sincerely wrong. There is one and only one way of salvation, and that is through Christ's substitutionary atoning death.
One more issue before we get to the essays, and that is the definition of human being. Ken, what are some of the complexities of that question?
Yeah, that's, as we entered into this conversation, that became one of the questions because scientists don't agree among themselves as to the definition of human being. That's one challenge. Theologians and biblical scholars are using a different definition. They're approaching it from a different starting point. And so the fact that we're using multiple definitions for human being, do we use an ontological definition? Do we use an observational definition? In other words, there are certain things that humans do, and therefore we define. If someone checks these boxes, intelligence, the various things that we'd say are the criteria, do we use that definition? So this is one of the challenges that we have in talking about the origin of humanity, is just what is the criteria and definition that we use in order to say this is how we say, yes, that's a human being. How do we identify a human being? And that was one of the things that ended up being a very vigorous debate. I know that, some of the things that Bill, and whenever he argues his position, he's going to say, well, see, these markers are there. And so that is one of these central questions that we are having to address. From a theological perspective, we start with the notion of the Imago Dei. We start with the very notion that humans are persons because we're reflectors of God, and God is one being who is three persons. And so using the definitions, biblical definitions of the image of God and personhood, and the fact that we are composite entities, that we have both a material and immaterial aspect to our persons, that we have that which is spiritual about us that survives death. Those are the kinds of markers that theologians are going to use. And so it makes for a very interesting conversation.
Yeah. Bill, were these some of the complexities, the markers you encountered when researching your book on the historical Adam?
Yes, since I wanted to explore when humanity first originated on this planet, I needed to know what we were talking about in looking for the first human beings. And it seemed to me that one could circumvent this problem of providing a definition by using what is called an ostensive definition. That is to say, you point to a typical member of the kind that you're talking about and say, that's what we're looking for. Now, we all know that we are human beings. And so we simply say, we're looking for something that is like that, someone like us. And there are markers, as Ken indicated, that anthropologists accept for modern cognitive human behaviors. And these would include things like abstract thinking, planning depth, to be able to anticipate the future and formulate strategies for that. There is behavioral, economic, and technological innovativeness, and then symbolic behavior, the ability to represent things with arbitrary symbols, whether visual or vocal. And so by looking for archaeological signatures or traces of these kind of modern cognitive behaviors, we can get an idea of when people like us first originated on this planet.
Ken, each contributor was asked to include the answers to 3 questions in their essays. What are those 3 questions?
Yeah, paraphrasing the 3 questions, basically it was asking, how does your view fit with the testimony of Scripture? And second, how does your view fit with the current understanding of science? And then third, how does your view impact the church today? And so those were the 3 questions that we asked them to address at some point in their essays.
Bill, how did you incorporate those 3 questions in your chapter?
Well, with respect to the biblical question, I attempted to give a genre analysis of the stories of Adam and Eve and of the primordial or primeval history in general in Genesis 1 to 11 as a key to its proper interpretation. Then with regard to the scientific evidence, I did a very thorough survey of what the discipline called paleoanthropology teaches us about ancient hominins, when they first originated and what their modern cognitive behavioral capacities were. As for the third question about how this would impact the message and ministry of the church, I just ignored that question. I didn't feel qualified to say anything about it, and space was limited. So I hope Ken excuses me for simply ignoring the third question in my essay.
I gave him grace.
Well, let's do our best to look at some of the highlights of each view. We're going to try to synopsize each of these views quickly. Ken, and let's start with Kenton Sparks. Give us a synopsis of his view.
Yes. There is, I think, one of the strong points of the book is that it really does have positions that address the ends of the spectrum. In other words, you're going to find one end of evangelicalism to the other, and there are two mediating positions. Kenton's position, I think that he will not be offended by me saying that he would probably be representative of the most progressive or left-leaning view of evangelicalism, in that he does not view the historicity of Adam and Eve as essential. In other words, he would understand the first chapters of Genesis to be theological fiction. He would agree with the young earth creationists like Marcus Ross in that he would say that a straightforward reading of the text requires that we understand Genesis to be teaching that the world is less than 10,000 years old. He just thinks that it's wrong. And that he would understand the empirical evidence to require us to approach Genesis not just from a non-literal approach, but a non-historical approach. Now, I want to hasten to say that Kenton identifies as an evangelical. I know that some would understand someone to deny the historicity of Adam and Eve to be someone who is beyond the pale of evangelicalism. But Kenton affirms the Nicene Creed. He affirms the Apostles' Creed. He holds to a very orthodox view of Christ, who he is and what he's done. And he would argue that his understanding of the New Testament and of the person of Christ is not threatened by having a non-historical Adam and Eve. And so that would be the first argument that is presented, which is the non-historical Adam and Eve position.
Bill, some thoughts on Kenton Sparks' essay?
Well, it's a very curious essay because you would expect someone who doesn't believe in the historicity of Adam and Eve to say that these stories are just ancient mythology. But that's not, in fact, Sparks's view. He apparently thinks that these Hebrew narratives of the primeval history were intended to be realistic accounts. In fact, in some ways, he's more of a literalist than Marcus Ross. He thinks that Genesis 1 means to teach, for example, that there is a hard dome over the earth in which the stars are embedded, and that this was intended literally. Now, if that is what Sparks's view is, it's striking that he gives almost no argument in the essay in support of that view. You look in vain for any argument to think that the narrative is intended to be read in that sort of literalistic wooden way. When it comes to the science, he has even less justification for saying that modern science rules out a historical Adam. Notice that Ken distinguished between the literalness of the narrative and the historicity of the narrative. What Kenton argues against is a literal interpretation of the story of God's creation of Adam, that's incompatible with modern science. But he doesn't have anything to say to show that modern science is incompatible with the historicity of Adam and Eve.
Let's talk about Andrew Loke's essay. Ken, what are his main points?
Yeah, I think we're all old enough to remember Monty Python, the TV show. And if you remember, they would be in the middle of one of their skits, and right in the middle of the skit, they would stop and say, "And now for something completely different." And I think that we need to understand the genealogical approach is that a Monty Python moment in which they do a hard stop and they'll say, "Hey, wait a minute, the whole debate about genetics is misguided because the Bible doesn't deal with genetics. The biblical authors didn't know anything about genetics. The biblical emphasis is on genealogy, and I don't know. I mean, you have to they're right. I think that Andrew and Joshua are definitely right about that. So they argue then that most of our direct ancestors are genetic ghosts. Now, so what does that mean? Well, there's been so much success with genetic research today to find out who your relatives are where your place of origin is, that we fail to realize that only works for a few generations. And whenever you hear the arithmetic, it makes a great deal of sense. I mean, you have two parents, and that means approximately half of your DNA comes from each parent. You have 4 grandparents, which means about a fourth of your DNA is from your each of your grandparents, give or take a little bit. You have 8 great-grandparents, 1/8. 16, 32, 64, 1, the numbers grow exponentially so that in only about 300 or 400 years, you have 1 million direct ancestors from which you directly descended from them. So the vast majority of that million direct ancestors, we can't find, it's not possible to find any genetic evidence that you descended from that particular ancestor. So this means most of our ancestors are genetic ghosts. And so they say the idea of trying to find mitochondrial Eve or Y chromosome Adam, all of that is misguided. There's also something else that it does. By the time we get back to the time of Christ, mathematically, we should have 1 billion direct ancestors. Well, there were only about 150 to 200 million people in all of the world at the time of Jesus. You go back to the time of David, 50 million, time of Abraham. There's more people in metro New York City than all of the world at the time of Abraham. And so their point is this, someone says, well, I descended from the pharaohs. Big deal, we all did. If anyone lived in the ancient world and they had children, we can safely assume that they are the ancestors of everyone. And so this means that anyone, think of any couple living about 6,000 years ago in the Middle East, could have been in this kind of setting described in Genesis, and they would be the common ancestors of everyone in the world. And here's where the math gets a little interesting. That would include the people in the faraway places like Australia and Tasmania and New Zealand. And I'll leave that to the mathematicians to work out. But they argue that that's true even for the out-of-the-way people groups. So what the genealogical Adam position argues is that God could have created a couple de novo, put them in a garden, tested them, they failed, they were expelled. They were intended to expand Eden throughout the whole world, but they failed. They're expelled from the garden, and here's where the genealogical Adam position will be very different from what most conservative evangelicals are comfortable with, and that is there were already humans outside of the garden. In other words, Andrew and Joshua would accept the evolutionary account of how the human race arrived. And so what you have is a position that, scientifically speaking, is innocuous. There's nothing about that position that could be demonstrated to be, in other words, it simply doesn't, science has nothing to say about it. And so that's the advantage of the genealogical position. So I set it up to where Andrew and Joshua have an Adam and Eve 6,000 years ago. I think that they would say, well, that's really an open question. They say it could be 50,000 years ago or even farther back. But the point is that the question is now irrelevant from a genealogical perspective. And so that would be the genealogical Adam and Eve position. Bill, would you have a different spin on it? That's basically the way I understand the position.
Yes, I think that the difficulty that I have with Andrew's position is these people outside the garden. I take it that one of the theologically non-negotiable points of the primeval history is that all human beings are descended from Adam and Eve, and that therefore there were no human beings outside the Garden of Eden. Now, to avoid this problem, what Andrew Locke says is that these people outside the garden were anatomically human, just like us, in their behavior, in their appearance, in their intelligence, and so forth. But they were not truly human because they weren't in the image of God. And I think that this is extremely problematic because it is predicated upon a view of the image of God, which distinguishes between human beings who are in God's image and human beings who are not in God's image. And as I read Genesis 1, every human being is created in the image of God. On Andrew's view, there could be people who look and act exactly like us, and yet they are not truly human beings. And I take that to be morally and theologically objectionable. And I also think that it's unscientific to say that people who exhibit these kind of modern cognitive capacities that I described, like symbolic behavior, abstract thinking, planning depth, are not truly human. Anyone who exhibits that kind of cognitive capacity is exhibiting traits of humanity. And so much as I appreciate Andrew, I just can't bring myself to embrace the position that he advocates.
And Marcus Ross represents the recent Adam and Eve view. Ken, what are his main points?
Yeah, Marcus is, he argues pretty close to what we would understand to be the position of like Ken Ham or of Whitcomb and Morris, and that is that the world itself was created around 10,000 years ago, and that Adam and Eve were the sole human beings, the sole progenitors, who were in a garden about 6,000 years ago, and then they were tempted and they fell. He argues very strongly from the New Testament. The various passages from 1 Peter, from Romans 5, Matthew 19, the various places that talk about the original creation. And it's very much a New Testament argument. He then will understand the geological column to be compressed. That is, rather than being over a period. The geological column is an interesting thing. You almost have to think of a number 2 pencil to understand the geological column. You think of a number 2 pencil. The most of it is just lead. I mean, just the pencil, and then at the top, you have the eraser. The pencil itself actually covers most of Earth's history for about 3 billion years plus. There were only single cell life on Earth. We're talking just bacteria. It isn't that which we associate with the geological column. That actually is only of the last 650 to 750 million years. And so whenever we see the geological column, we think of it as being Earth's history, but it's actually just a brief portion of it. Well, that's helpful to understand. Marcus takes that and goes much further in his argument. He compresses the geological column literally into less than 12 months, and that he argues that all of that happened at Noah's flood. I think he does. I think he does a very effective job of presenting his viewpoint, and he does it so in a very winsome way. But that would be, in a nutshell, how he would understand how it is that we are to understand Genesis and how we're to understand Earth's history.
And Bill, you offered a rejoinder to Marcus Ross. What are some of your reservations about his?
Well, with regard to the biblical question, I think he gives a good survey of the biblical accounts of creation. But what I don't see from him is a compelling argument for saying that these have to be interpreted literally, rather than, in many cases, figuratively. Now, while I think the biblical interpretive position of young earth creationism is not implausible, I don't think you can say that about the young earth creationist scientific position. On his interpretation of Genesis 1 to 11, the entire world is less than 2,000 years old at the time of Abraham's birth. He has to compress the entirety of geological time from the Cambrian through the Cretaceous period into the 150 days of Noah's flood. And I think that is simply scientifically unbelievable.
Well, Bill, let's get to your essay. Summarize it for us. And then, Ken, you may have some questions or comments on Bill's chapter.
Okay. With regard to the interpretive question, I wanted to explore what kind of literature the stories of Adam and Eve are. And they belong to the so-called primeval history of Genesis 1 to 11. So what kind of literature is this? It's important that we understand that the Bible contains many different types or genre of literature. For example, the book of Acts is historical writing. The Gospels are ancient biography. Paul's letters are epistolary literature. The book of Revelation is apocalyptic literature. The Psalms are poetry. And these different types of literature are not meant to be all read in the same way. In particular, some of them, if read literally, would give you a terrible misinterpretation. If you read the Psalms or the book of Revelation with a sort of wooden literality, you would be really led astray. So when it comes to Genesis 1 to 11, what kind of literature is this? Well, I argue on the basis of various family resemblances or earmarks that these belong to a genre of myth. And by myth, I don't mean falsehood. Rather, I'm speaking in the sense of the folklorist. Folklorists distinguish between myth, fables, and legends. And myths are stories that are told in a society that attempt to ground the institutions and values of that society in events deep in the primordial past. And this is exactly the purpose of Genesis 1 to 11. So I think that these narratives are in some measure quasi-mythical. They belong to the literary genre of myth. Now, what's interesting about myth, when you look at myths in the world, is that they are not necessarily to be read literally. They very frequently employ figurative and metaphorical language. And I suggest that that's what you have in Genesis 1 to 11. That's not the whole story, however, because the stories of Genesis 1 to 11 are joined together by the genealogies of the principal characters in these stories, which forms a sort of backbone that orders the narratives historically. And so they have a historical interest in them. They are about people who actually lived and wrought, and real events that happened, but they are related in the figurative and metaphorical language of myth. And so some ancient Assyriologists have referred to this type of literature as mytho-history. It's not pure mythology. It's not straightforward history. It's a mytho-history. And I think that gives us the best genre analysis of these narratives, which implies that they need not be read with a sort of literalness. Now, when I turn then to the scientific evidence and ask, when did human beings first begin to walk the face of the earth? The evidence indicates, I think, that humanity originated sometime prior to the divergence of Neanderthals and Homo sapiens around 550,000 years ago or so. And the last or most recent common ancestor of Neanderthals and Homo sapiens was Homo heidelbergensis, or Heidelberg man. Heidelberg man had a brain capacity comparable to modern human beings, and he exhibited those types of modern cognitive behaviors that I spoke of earlier in our interview. And so my suggestion is that Adam and Eve were members of the species Homo heidelbergensis, that they were the human pair from whom the entire human race is descended, and that this is fully consonant with not only the archaeological and paleontological evidence, but also with the evidence of population genetics that Ken spoke about earlier.
Ken, any comments or questions for Bill on his view?
Yeah, I want to commend Bill for his bravery to use the label of myth as an evangelical. That's a bit of a lightning rod, as one can imagine. Bill, what kind of response did you get whenever you first published your work in Quest for the Historical Jesus, or Historical Adam?
I was really bracing for pushback. I actually went to the pastor of our local church here that we attend, told him the book was coming out, and said to him that there could be terrible controversy about this, and that if he wanted me to step down from teaching as a Sunday school teacher, I would do so in submission to his authority. Well, that controversy never arrived. I think that what you said earlier in our podcast, Ken, about the remarkable openness there is in the evangelical community to non-young earth views is very evident. And so I have been really pleased and surprised at the openness and the reception that the view has received. I was inspired in this view by a book by Miller and Soden, which you may know, a couple of professors at a Bible college in Pennsylvania, who wrote a book called In the Beginning, We Misunderstood. And they argued for this sort of mythical genre of these narratives. And so I really commend them for being the ones that had the courage to talk about this rather than me. And I later found out that this view was also propounded by people like C.S. Lewis, for example, who is highly revered among evangelicals. So I've found real openness to the position that I presented. So
there are some, I'm thinking now of someone like James Hoffmeyer, who would use the expression proto-history. Would you be comfortable with that terminology, or how would you distinguish your position, mytho-history, from proto-history?
I think that a number of Old Testament scholars who have been reluctant to embrace the term myth or mytho have adopted other terms that are the equivalent. Proto-history would be one. Another I've seen is worldview history. Another was theological history. John Walton talks about imagistic history. And I think all of these are getting at exactly the same point, so that the view that I'm arguing for, I think, is actually pretty widespread among evangelical Old Testament scholars under different names.
Well, I was glad to hear you say that there is a historical backbone and that the particulars are things that have a historical referent. I think that's crucial for any position that's going to take Genesis seriously. And so moving over to the science side, I find what you had to say about Heidelbergensis very interesting, that Adam and Eve, you understood them to be of that species. So do you, in your way of thinking, understand that species and the Denisovans and the Neanderthals and the modern, what we'd call Homo sapiens, do you understand them to all be the same species?
I think that's a biological question that needs to be settled by the scientists, Ken, not by someone like me. They did interbreed successfully. They sired children. And as you know, we have Neanderthal DNA in our genome.
The fact that we are Caucasians, yeah.
And people in the Philippines and Pacific Islands may have as much as 5% of their genome from Denisovans. Mm-hmm. So it could be that these are not really different species of human beings, but maybe more like different races of human beings that are all capable of interbreeding. So those kind of classifications are not, I think, important in my thinking. What's important is that they were fully and truly human, exhibiting that kind of modern cognitive behavior that we would recognize in our fellows, whom we regard as human beings. And so I think we're going to see some of these people in heaven. I think some of them are covered by Christ's atoning death, and we're going to see them.
Yes, if I was going to say one further thing that I would like to see you do, perhaps in the future, and I'll close my comments on this, and that would be maybe to do some type of exposition of Genesis 1 through 11, in which you, in other words, applying your genre to the text itself, saying, okay, now this is what that looks like. Because I think, going back, now I am pushing you on question number 3. If you remember the third question, not only, what's the science, what is it, and that is the third one, how does that apply to the church? Yeah. So the question I would have, and this is Pastor Ken, how do I preach this? In other words, how would I preach Genesis 1 through 11 to my congregation in a way that embraces your genre critique, your genre evaluation, and ministers to a congregation in the 21st century? And so I'll just leave it on that may be something that might be helpful.
Yes.
Well, let's wrap it up today with the afterword. Josh Swamidas, he's really been involved in this discussion. What are some of his thoughts in the afterword, Ken?
Yeah, I was glad to have Joshua there at this at the colloquium. I was glad to have him to do an afterwards, and basically the afterwards was, okay, what do we do now? How do we take it from here? And I appreciated the conciliatory tone that he took. He emphasized how this is not a battle among enemies. This is a conversation around the dinner table among family members, and we need to make sure that is the way that we have this conversation. I do think that is the way that all of the participants, that is the attitude and spirit they exhibited. And I think that Joshua's his afterward kind of highlights that's whatever we do next, let's do it in such a way that magnifies Christ through our gentle spirit.
Bill, thoughts on Josh's afterwards?
Well, Josh is a real conciliator, I think, and wants to bring people together. He has a sweet spirit about him. And so I think that Ken is quite right in saying that Josh's message is one that we need to hear, that we're not enemies on this, but we're striving together to find the best view theologically and scientifically that can be held. And so Josh's contribution is one that is very valued. Well, as we wrap up today, Kevin and I want to thank you both for your work and your ministry and for joining us today. What do you hope that this book will accomplish?
I'm thinking of the next generation of Christians who perhaps will go into the STEM fields. I'm thinking the best way that we can advance the kingdom of God in the arena of the academic world and the scientific arena is by having godly men and women who become biochemists, they become geneticists, they engage in the sciences. I think that they need to have a robust confidence in the doctrine of creation and confidence in the Bible as the Word of God. And I'm hoping that this book will help them to have that so that they can be believers in a field that desperately needs more Bible-believing Christians.